Good morning, everyone. In behalf of the three presenters and myself, I would like to welcome you to this group. And it is a group about cosmic conflict and the Gospels. So we have three presenters, but before I begin introducing them kind of separately before their presentations, I would like to explain how we are going to proceed. Excuse me. So we'll begin with the first presenter. Each presenter will have 20 minutes. All right? So with the three of them, that's 1 hour. And we'll be left with 15 minutes, if everything goes well, with 15 minutes, and you will be able to react, which means to make a comment, hopefully not very long, and to ask some questions. And for that, we'll have 15 minutes. And I would like to request you that when you ask your questions, that you tell us which of the presenters All right, so the first presenter is Kenley Hall, who teaches homiletics and youth and young adults ministries at Andrews University Seminary. His degrees, Masters of Divinity and Doctoral Ministry, they are from the Andrews University Seminary. He is a founding pastor of One Place, which is a worshiping community for young adults. Here is the topic of his presentation: Jesus' exorcism of the temple, the interplay between the cosmic conflict and racial conflict. Let's welcome Kenley Hall.
Thank you. All right, so this paper is presented. We'll focus on the interplay between the cosmic conflict and racial conflict as seen in the Mark 11 narrative of Jesus' cleansing of the temple. And to get a deeper level meaning of the story, the narrative as it plays out, and to understand that it's not just merely an encounter between Jesus and merchants or money changers in the sanctuary, requires a deeper exploration of the literary context of the book of Mark. And so I'm going to cut through a lot of this just to save time. But one of the questions I have at the earlier part of the paper is, what evidence is there in the Gospel of Mark that connects Mark to the apocalyptic genre? And there's intentionality in the use of term connects Mark to the apocalyptic genre, as Carol Newsom argues. Rather than thinking of text as belonging to genres, one might think of text as participating in them by invoking them. And so I'm going to lean into, to connect Mark to the apocalyptic genre, to connect us to the cosmic conflict that's really playing out in the book of Mark. I'm going to lean into some of the research done by Howard Key, who believes that in Mark there are two different sets of evidence that point to Mark's apocalyptic genre. Number one, he believes it is seen in Mark's view of history. And he points specifically to Mark's view of history as expressed through its dual modality of history. Two different modes of historical time. One, the literary mode of time, which is onsets at the present crisis in the book of Mark, while it points back the historical antecedents and forward to eschatological culmination. Its central focus is on the meaning and existence in the present moment and the response of the faithful community to that crisis. The second mode of historical time that connects it into the apocalyptic genre is the eschatological historical mode, where God's purposes are being foiled by demonic forces, and God calls upon his community to persevere through wisdom and insight given them through special revelation, that only those who are privileged to the mystery get in on the secret and understand those mysteries of God, which are oftentimes delivered through the context of a great figure from the past. And ultimately what's revealed is the ultimate defeat of the powers of oppression and the victory of the faithful. The second way in which Mark's gospel connects to the apocalyptic genre is through the intertexture of apocalyptic discourse which is seen in the utilization of apocalyptic topoi. And Key asserts or points to 5 common topoi in apocalyptic discourse. Number 1, it asserts the triumph of God's rule. Number 2, it asserts the defeat of hostile powers. Number 3, it redefines the community of faith. Number 4, it demonstrates a certainty of outcomes. And number 5, it presents a message to the current community to stand firm. And so I'm going to use those modes of history, and I'm going to use those apocalyptic topoi to look at Mark, the 11th chapter, both the cursing of the fig tree and the cleansing of the sanctuary. And so if we look at that from the apocalyptic mode of time and apocalyptic discourse, I think we begin to discover the deeper meaning of the text that's not limited to just an encounter between Jesus and some money changers and merchants in the context of the temple cleansing story. So if we look at the literary mode of time, all right, the narrative of Mark commences with the onset of the present crisis, while it points back to historical antecedents and forward to eschatological culmination. And Jesus' direct quotes in the temple cleansing from Isaiah 56 and Jeremiah 7 sets the present crisis that Jesus is responding to in the temple in the context of historical antecedents. And if we had time, we'd look deeper at this, but here's what we know about the 2 texts that Jesus references that are the stated reasons for his actions in the cleansing of the sanctuary, or the cleansing of the temple. Isaiah 56, which Myers argues is perhaps the fullest Old Testament vision of inclusive worship. In fact, Isaiah 56 is written in the context of God inviting foreigners, God inviting outcasts to join together on his holy mountain and to become an inclusive house of prayer for all nations and all people. And what's fascinating in Isaiah 56 is it goes beyond Jesus just inviting inclusive worship when it comes to the area of prayer, which could have taken place in any of the courtyards of Herod's temple. But Jesus also invites foreigners into the practice of sacrifice, which can only take place within the context of the inner sanctuary. Additionally, in Jeremiah, the 7th chapter, Myers maintains that the prophetic oracle in Jeremiah 7 is one of the bitterest attacks upon the temple state in the Hebrew Bible. In fact, Jeremiah makes it very clear that their covenant with God will be invalidated if they continue to oppress and to marginalize aliens, orphans, and widows. Even perhaps more fascinating in the Jeremiah 7 passage is the Hebrew phrase that's used, interpreted, make a den of thieves, which the actual interpretation of the word means to create a group of marauding gangs that resort to violence and murder to achieve their ends. Something that Mark holds clearly in his own translation of the word that Jesus uses when he talks about a den of robbers. He doesn't refer to them as kleptos, which means to abscond with somebody else's property through cunning and secrecy. Instead, he uses lestesis, which means to be a predator that travels in gangs and achieves their goals through a ruthless use of force and violence. And if we look at the second mode of history as displayed in these 2 narratives of Mark the 11th, that God's purposes are being thwarted by demonic forces, but his community of faithful survive through the wisdom and the insight given them through special revelation that's often given through a great figure in Jewish history. Well, if we look at that in the context of the Mark 11 story, the concept that demonic forces are preventing God's purposes for his temple is seen in the compound verb that Mark uses to describe Jesus' action in the temple. And it's said that Jesus ekbalos those in the temple. The word ekbalo is made up, of course, it's a compound verb made up of the verb balo, to throw, to cast, and the preposition ek, out. So the meaning of the composition verb is to cast out, but the reason that the compound verb is used here is to add forcefulness to the act of casting out in the sense of ejecting or repelling by force. And that word ekbalo is used 17 times in the book of Mark, and 10 of those times are used directly in the context of casting out demons, or in the context of exorcism. And even the 5 others that are not used in the direct context of exorcism are still used in the context of demanding someone to leave quickly, a stern warning, and delivered in forceful terms. Mark uses this term ekbalo in one other place, and it's here in the temple cleansing scene, meaning that the word, if we keep it in textual usage, the implication of Mark's usage of this word is that the temple is possessed, and Jesus is literally performing an exorcism of the temple. And interestingly enough, also holding to this apocalyptic use of eschatological historical mode, it is a great figure from the past that unveils the secret to the community. The special revelation to that community is embedded in Mark's use of the literary technique of intercalation to reveal the mystery that Jesus is trying to teach those who he's granted that mystery to. And it's delivered through the embodiment of the greatest figure of Israel's past, is delivered from the Son of Man. In fact, 14 times Jesus refers to himself throughout Mark as the Son of Man, and by using that phrase, I don't have time to unpack all of this, but I would suggest to you that he is intentionally identifying himself with 2 Old Testament connections. He is identifying himself to the eschatological prophet who, like Ezekiel, speaks about the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem, and he is connecting himself to the Daniel figure, the one like the Son of Man, who when he comes to the Ancient of Days and is enthroned, the Son of Man ushers in inclusive worship that includes people of all nations, Gentiles, people of every language, connecting himself intentionally by the use of Son of Man to both the Ezekiel prophet who predicts destruction on the temple and the inclusive worship that would be ushered in by the Son of Man in Daniel, the 7th chapter. Right? Now let's look at the same idea of Mark 11 through the 5 apocalyptic topoi that we talked about from Key's writing. Number 1, asserting the triumph of God's rule. God, who has allowed powers opposed to him to operate in damaging ways in human history, is now going to defeat those powers by inaugurating his kingdom. However, again, that revelation of how he's going to do that is delivered in a hidden language that can only be decrypted by the elect. And here that decryption comes through Mark's use of intercalation. And I'm going to lean into, because scholars broadly agree that Mark uses the literary style of intercalation. They're not as much in agreement on exactly what that intercalation definition would be, but I'm going to lean into my colleague Tom Shepard's definition of intercalation, which is the Markan literary style by which the evangelist interrupts the flow of one story with another individual story in order to produce a dramatized irony between key characters and their actions. Buki describes, as he talks in his book about irony, he says that when it comes to the literary form of irony in the narrative, what creates the irony requires 3 essential elements: duality, the opposition of terms, and the element of allozoning. Right? And Mark is very intentional in his use of each of these in sandwiching together the story of the cursing of the fig tree and the cleansing of the temple. Right? In the stories of both the cursing of the fig tree and the cleansing of the temple, Jesus is the only primary character that crosses over from the outer narrative of the cursing of the fig tree to the inner narrative, which is the cleansing of the temple. And the opposition in terms is displayed in the parallels and contrast between the characters in the narrative that do not cross each other, between the outer story and the inner story. And those 2 central characters that do not cross each other are the fig tree in the outer story and the temple in the inner story. And it is in the actions not done by them, but the actions done to them that should be seen in contrast. The fig tree is cursed. May no one ever, says Jesus, eat fruit from you again, a negative action. The temple is exorcised. When Jesus entered the temple area, he began to ekbalo it, a positive action. And the duality of the narratives and their opposition of terms helps to create an allozomy in one or both narratives. And an allozomy is a character who's an imposter character in the story who sees themselves as greater than they are. The fig tree seems to be full of life and vitality. It was in leaf. However, it was devoid of the fruit that Jesus hungered for. The temple seemed to be full of holiness and purity, yet Jesus had to exorcise it. Right? And the perception, one other thing that Buki adds to his concept of what's required for an allozomy is that the perception of the irony in the story depends on the hearer's ability to perceive that irony. And throughout Mark, the only people that are ever in the know are the disciples, who most of the time Jesus reveals his secrets through parable, but I would suggest in the context of Mark 11 reveals his secret through the use of intercalation. As previously stated, additionally, the implication of Mark's usage of ekbalo in the temple cleansing narrative is that the temple is possessed and Jesus is performing an exorcism. And why is Jesus performing an exorcism? He gives the reason, Isaiah 56:7, the reason for his actions. The temple has failed. No, I would suggest it is refused to become what God envisioned through the prophets, an intercultural house of prayer. It's becoming something that Jesus then points to in Jeremiah, the 7th chapter. He describes it as a den of thieves. In other words, it has become a roaming gang that resorts to violence and murder and force to achieve its ends. And I hope that you understand it, that you see in that it is inappropriate in terms of its present context to apply that to the merchants or the money changers, who simply do not qualify in the context of being a violent or ruthless robber and murderer. I saw my 5-minute mark, so I'm quickly going through that, which I can skip through. All right? So Mark embeds in the intercalation a clear understanding of both the outer story and the inner story. In the inner story, Jesus performs an exorcism in the temple because the temple has not become what God envisioned the temple was going to become through his Old Testament prophets, a place of intercultural worship and a place of intercultural gathering. Jesus is calling for, in fact, Jesus is now come to usher in a kingdom in which intercultural worship is a central aspect of that. And if that community is going to take root, then the temple that has developed into an institutional symbol of nationalistic exclusivism must either begin to produce the fruit of inclusion God desires for it to bear, or like the fig tree, it loses its relevance and it loses its importance along the way. So let me move to the conclusion that I'll move us to here. Mark utilizes an apocalyptic modes of time and apocalyptic discourse through the utilization of apocalyptic topoi to connect his book to the apocalyptic literature of his time. Thus he connects the events of his narrative into the larger narrative of cosmic conflict. The temple cleansing narrative in the Gospel of Mark has a deeper level meaning than just an encounter between Jesus and the narrative's surface level antagonists, the merchants and the money changers. It also goes beyond the temple leaders' thwarted of God's plan for a house of inclusive worship. Mark puts the temple struggle in the context of the cosmic conflict, human willfulness combined with demonic conspiracy has created a temple atmosphere of racial conflict driven by ethnocentric pride. If we'd had time, we could have talked about how Herod's temple was divided into exclusionary courtyards, unlike any other temple of its kind. And Jesus' response to the interplay between the cosmic conflict and racial conflict in the temple was twofold. First, he exorcised the temple from the demonic forces that were frustrating God's purposes for an inclusive house of worship, so that they could then, free of demonic influence, could carry out God's will in the household of God. Second, he gave a warning through the cursing of the fig tree that time can run out for fruitless trees and exclusive temples. If the current temple will not become a place of its inclusive worship, then God will raise up a reconstituted community that will bring his vision of inclusive worship into the present reality. So I wonder today, as we think about Mark and what he presents, about Jesus' intentionality of exercising the temple to create an atmosphere that he'd envisioned through his prophets of inclusive worship. I wonder how that speaks to our faith communities today. I wonder how it speaks to faith communities today that are oftentimes committed to a homogeneous approach to ministry. I wonder today what Jesus would see in some of our faith communities in the midst of the cosmic conflict. If he would see communities much like he saw in the community of his day. A community that's ethnocentric pride, and a community whose desire to maintain purity and holiness of their own culture, and made the temple something that Jesus never intended it to be an exclusive place of worship, but not an inclusive place of worship.